The air in Savannah carried the weight of August like a wet cloth pressed against the mouth. 1826 had been a year of storms and stillness, of cotton prices dropping and tempers rising. The Whitmore plantation sat on the eastern edge of the county, where the land began its slow descent into marshland, where the soil turned black and the water reflected nothing but shadows. It was there that Elias was born. His mother, Amma, died 3 days after his birth. Fever, they said, the kind that turned the eyes yellow and made the body shake until it gave up. She'd been a field worker, her hands scarred from the cotton bolls, her back bent from the weight of sacks she carried from dawn until the overseer's bell rang at dusk. No one knew who Elias's father was. Some said it was another slave from a neighboring plantation. Others whispered it was the master's youngest son, though no one dared say it louder than a breath. Elias grew up silent. While other children ran between the cabins, laughing and shouting in the few hours they had before being put to work, Elias sat alone. He watched. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. His eyes were dark and unnervingly still, the kind of eyes that seemed to see past the surface of things. The women who cared for him said he never cried as a baby, never screamed. He simply stared, as if waiting for something. By the time he was 5, he had spoken fewer than a dozen words. "Boy's slow," said Marcus, the plantation's head carpenter, a man whose freedom had been promised and never delivered. "Ain't right in the head." But Elias wasn't slow. He moved with purpose, even as a child. He helped the older women gather kindling. He sat by the fire and listened when the elders told stories, and at night, when the others slept, he would slip outside and look up at the sky. No one thought much of it, not until the summer he turned 7. It started with the horse. Old Crescent was the master's favorite mare, a chestnut-colored animal with a white blaze down her face. She had carried Richard Whitmore through 2 counties and had never once faltered. But that morning, she collapsed in the stable, her legs trembling, foam gathering at her mouth. The overseer, a man named Dutch Calloway, came running. He was a thick-shouldered Irishman with a red face and a temper that matched it. He shouted for the stable hands, for someone to fetch water, for someone to do something. But the horse's eyes were rolling back, her breathing shallow and desperate. That's when they found Elias. He was kneeling beside the horse, one small hand resting on her neck. His lips were moving, forming words no one recognized. The stable hand stopped. Calloway froze. The boy's voice was soft but clear, each syllable precise and deliberate. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like anything they'd ever heard. "What the hell is he saying?" Calloway demanded. No one answered. They couldn't. But as Elias continued to speak, the horse's breathing steadied. Her legs stopped shaking. The foam at her mouth began to dry. Within minutes, she was standing again, her eyes clear, her body calm. Calloway grabbed Elias by the arm and yanked him to his feet. "What did you do?" Elias looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "I asked her to stay." "Asked her? In what language?" The boy tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "The old one." Calloway dragged him to the main house. Richard Whitmore was a man of routine and control. His plantation ran like a clock, every piece in its place, every hand accounted for. He sat behind his mahogany desk when Calloway brought Elias in, his pale eyes narrowing as the overseer explained what had happened. "He was speaking gibberish over the horse," Calloway said, "and the damn thing just got up." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Bring him closer." Elias stepped forward without hesitation. He was small for his age, his clothes patched and faded, his feet bare. But he didn't look afraid. He simply stood there, waiting. "What were you saying, boy?" Whitmore asked. "A prayer," Elias replied. "A prayer? Who taught you to pray?" "No one." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not lying, sir." Elias's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I've always known it." "Known what?" The words. Whitmore exchanged a glance with Calloway. Say them again. Elias took a breath, and then he spoke. The words flowed from him like water over stone, smooth and ancient. They filled the room, echoing off the walls, curling into the corners. Whitmore's eyes widened. Calloway took a step back. It was Latin. Perfect, formal, ecclesiastical Latin. Domine, exaudi orationem meam, et clamor meus, libera animum quae humilis est, et de pacem quae laborat. Lord, hear my prayer, and let my cry come unto thee. Deliver the soul that is humble, and give peace to that which labors. Whitmore shot to his feet. Where did you learn that? I told you. I've always known it. That's impossible. Elias said nothing. He simply looked at the master with those dark, unblinking eyes. Whitmore's hand trembled as he reached for the bell on his desk. Get Father Matthias, now. Father Matthias arrived 3 days later. He was an old man, bent with age, his white hair thin and his hands spotted with liver marks. He had served the Catholic community in Savannah for over 30 years, and he carried with him the weight of scripture and ritual. When he entered the study, Elias was already there, seated on a wooden stool, his hands folded in his lap. This is the boy? Father Matthias asked. Yes, Whitmore said. He speaks something. I need you to tell me what it is. Udim, the priest approached slowly, his eyes scanning Elias with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Hello, child. Elias looked up, and then, in a voice as clear as church bells, he spoke. Salve, pater. Benedictus est tu in nomine Domini, quid queris apuero qui verba veterum locitur? Greetings, Father. Blessed are you in the name of the Lord. What do you seek from a boy who speaks the words of the ancients? The priest's face went white, his legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor. When he woke, he was trembling. Whitmore and Calloway helped him into a chair, but his eyes never left Elias. That was St. Augustine, the priest whispered. From Confessions, Book 10, he quoted it perfectly. How is that possible? Whitmore demanded. I don't know. Father Matthias's voice cracked. He's never been taught. He's never seen the text, and yet he knows it. Elias tilted his head. I know many things, Father. The priest crossed himself. What are you? The boy smiled faintly. I am Elias. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, scholars from Savannah, Charleston, and even as far as Richmond began arriving at the plantation. They brought books, parchments, tests. They asked Elias to read passages he had never seen. They spoke to him in Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Each time he responded flawlessly. One scholar, a man named Dr. Cornelius Shaw, wrote in his journal, the child is either a vessel of divine knowledge or a conduit for something far darker. I cannot determine which. His words are accurate beyond reason. His demeanor unsettles me. I do not believe he is human in the way we understand it. At night, the other slaves began to avoid him. They no longer invited him to sit by the fire. They no longer spoke his name. Fear had replaced curiosity, but Elias didn't seem to notice. He continued to speak to the stars, whispering names in languages no one recognized. He traced symbols in the dirt that looked like ancient scripts, and when the master tried to beat him into silence, Elias looked up and said, in Latin, non potes punire quod non intelligis. You cannot punish what you do not understand. 3 nights later, the chapel burned. The flames rose high into the night, turning the sky orange and red. People ran from their cabins shouting, trying to save what they could. But the fire was too strong, too fast. When the sun rose, only charred beams remained, and Elias was gone. Some said he ran north. Others swore they saw him walk into the flames, his small figure swallowed by the light. But in the years that followed, travelers passing through the ruins claimed they heard a voice on the wind, a child's voice, reciting words in a language older than memory, calm, clear, eternal. The weeks following the fire brought an uneasy silence to the Whitmore plantation. The chapel's blackened skeleton stood like a warning against the Georgia sky, its burned timbers jutting upward like broken fingers. Richard Whitmore ordered the wreckage cleared, but none of the slaves would touch it. They said the ground was cursed, that the ashes still whispered at night. Whitmore didn't believe in curses. He believed in order, in control, in the natural hierarchy of the world as God had designed it. But he couldn't explain Elias, and he couldn't forget the boy's eyes when he had spoken those final words in Latin. The scholars left one by one, their journals filled with contradictory notes and half-formed theories. Dr. Shaw departed without saying goodbye, his hands shaking as he climbed into his carriage. Father Matthias returned to Savannah and never spoke of the boy again. When pressed by his congregation, he would only say, "Some mysteries are not meant to be solved by men." But the story didn't die with their silence. It spread. From plantation to plantation, from port to port, the tale of the slave child who spoke in tongues traveled like wind through dry grass. Some versions claimed he was possessed by demons. Others said he was touched by God. A few whispered that he was something older than either, something that had existed before the Bible was written. In the slave quarters, the elders spoke in hushed tones. They remembered stories their grandparents had told, stories brought across the ocean in the bellies of ships, stories of children born with old souls, who carried the memories of ancestors long dead. They called them the returned ones. "That boy wasn't just Elias," said old Ruth, a woman whose age no one knew, but whose word was rarely questioned. "He was everyone who came before him, every tongue, every life. He was remembering." Marcus the carpenter shook his head. "Remembering what? He's 7 years old." "Age don't matter when the soul is ancient," Ruth replied, her voice firm. "That child was speaking the language of the first people, the ones who built the temples and wrote the laws. He wasn't learning, he was recalling. But not everyone believed in souls or spirits. Dutch Calloway, the overseer, believed in flesh and blood and the crack of the whip. He believed Elias had been a trick, a clever con, orchestrated by someone smarter than a field slave had any right to be. "Someone taught him," Calloway muttered to Whitmore one evening. "Had to be one of the house slaves. Maybe one of them learned Latin from a book and passed it on." "None of them can read," Whitmore said flatly. "Then maybe a priest visited years ago. Maybe the boy overheard something." "Overheard St. Augustine, word for word." Whitmore's voice was sharp. "Don't insult my intelligence, Dutch." Calloway fell silent, but his unease remained, festering like an infected wound. The truth was, no one wanted to believe what they had seen. It was easier to explain it away, to reduce it to superstition or fraud, because the alternative was too vast, too terrifying to hold in the mind for long. If Elias was real, if what he spoke was genuine, then the world was not what they thought it was. 2 months after the fire, a visitor arrived at the plantation. His name was Solomon Gray, and he was a free black man from Charleston. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that made even Whitmore hesitate before speaking to him. Gray was a translator and historian, one of the few black men in the South who had been allowed an education. He had learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew from a sympathetic minister, and he had spent years collecting stories from enslaved people, preserving their languages and memories. When he heard about Elias, he knew he had to see the place for himself. Whitmore received him reluctantly. "I don't know what you expect to find here. The boy is gone." "I'm not looking for the boy," Gray said calmly. "I'm looking for the truth. The truth is he was an oddity, a freak of nature, nothing more." "Then you have nothing to fear from my questions." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You have one day." Gray spent the morning walking the plantation grounds. He spoke to the slaves, though most were wary of him. They didn't know if he was a spy for the master or someone they could trust, but a few opened up. "He wasn't like other children," said a woman named Celia who had worked in the kitchen. He didn't play, didn't laugh. He just watched, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Did he ever speak to you? Gray asked. Once. I asked him why he was always staring at the sky. He said he was listening. Listening to what? The voices, the ones that came before. Gray wrote everything down in a leather-bound journal. He visited the ruins of the chapel, running his fingers along the charred wood. The air there felt different, heavier, older. He knelt and sifted through the ashes, finding nothing but blackened stone and melted metal, but as he stood to leave, he heard it. A whisper, faint, barely audible, like wind through a crack in the wall. But it wasn't wind, it was a voice, a child's voice. Gray froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, scanning the ruins. There was no one there, but the voice continued, soft and rhythmic, forming words he recognized. Latin, ego sum qui fui, ego sum qui ero, nemo mi delere potest. I am who I was, I am who I will be, no one can erase me. Gray's hands trembled as he wrote the words down. He stayed there for an hour, listening, waiting for the voice to return. But it didn't. The ruins fell silent again, as if the moment had passed. When he returned to the main house, Whitmore was waiting. Did you find what you were looking for? I found questions, Gray said carefully, and I suspect you have no answers. If you're looking for ghosts, you won't find them here. I'm not looking for ghosts, Mr. Whitmore. I'm looking for memory. Gray paused. And memory is far more powerful than any ghost. He left the plantation that evening, but he didn't leave the story behind. He returned to Charleston and began compiling his notes, cross-referencing the phrases Elias had spoken with ancient texts. Every word the boy had said was accurate, not close, not approximate, perfect. It was as if he had lived in ancient Rome, walked the streets of Jerusalem, sat in the councils of early Christian theologians. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Gray wrote to colleagues in Europe, in England, in the northern states. He shared his findings with scholars and linguists. Most dismissed him. A few were intrigued. And one, a professor at Yale named Dr. Edmund Cross, wrote back with a theory that chilled Gray to his core. If the boy truly spoke these languages without instruction, then we must consider that language is not learned, but inherited. That within us lies the accumulated knowledge of every ancestor who came before. We call it instinct in animals. But what if, in rare cases, a human mind can access that ancestral library? What if memory is not personal, but collective? Gray read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his journal. He never published his findings. He never spoke publicly about Elias, but until the day he died, he kept that journal close, and on the final page he wrote a single sentence. I believe the boy was not possessed. I believe he was remembering. And if that is true, then we are all libraries waiting to be opened. Back at the Whitmore plantation, life continued as it always had. The cotton grew, the slaves worked, the masters profited. But something had changed. The slaves no longer sang as they worked. The overseers were quicker to anger, and at night, when the wind passed through the burned chapel, people swore they could hear it, a voice, young and eternal, speaking in a language older than the earth itself. Winter came early to Georgia that year. The fields turned brittle and brown, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The slaves huddled close to their fires at night, whispering stories to keep the cold at bay. But the story they told most often was the one about Elias. It had been nearly 4 months since the fire, and still no one knew what had happened to him. Some believed he had died in the flames, his small body consumed before anyone could reach him. Others claimed he had escaped, slipping into the swamps where bloodhounds couldn't track him. And a few, those who had heard the whispers in the ruins, believed he had never left at all. Richard Whitmore tried to bury the story. He forbade anyone on the plantation from speaking the boy's name. He burned the scholar's notes and dismissed Father Matthias's warnings as the ramblings of an old man losing his mind. But the story refused to die. It lived in the glances exchanged between slaves, in the prayers muttered under breath, in the dreams that woke people in the middle of the night, gasping. Elias had become a ghost, not because he was dead, but because no one could explain what he had been when he was alive. On a cold December morning, a letter arrived at the plantation. It was addressed to Richard Whitmore, written in elegant script on expensive parchment. The seal bore the crest of the Catholic Diocese of Charleston. Whitmore broke the seal and read, "Mr. Whitmore, I write to you with grave concern regarding the matter of the child known as Elias. It has come to the attention of the Church that this boy exhibited signs of what can only be described as miraculous or, conversely, diabolical phenomena. As you are aware, the Church takes such matters seriously. I have been dispatched by His Excellency Bishop John England to conduct an official inquiry into the events that transpired at your estate. I will arrive within the fortnight." In faith and service, Father Ignatius Brennan Whitmore crumpled the letter in his fist. "Damn priests," he muttered. Dutch Calloway, who had been standing nearby, frowned. What do they want? An inquiry. They want to investigate the boy. The boy's gone. They don't care. They want to label him a miracle or a demon. Either way, it makes me look like a fool. Calloway crossed his arms. What are you going to tell them? The truth. That he was a strange child who spoke languages he shouldn't have known. That he disappeared. End of story. But Whitmore knew it wouldn't be that simple. The Church didn't send investigators unless they believed something significant had occurred. And if they declared Elias a miracle, the plantation would become a pilgrimage site. If they declared him a demon, it would be burned to the ground. Either way, Whitmore would lose everything. Father Ignatius Brennan arrived exactly 2 weeks later. He was younger than Whitmore had expected, perhaps 40, with a sharp face and eyes that missed nothing. He wore the black cassock of a Jesuit priest, and he carried with him a leather satchel filled with books, holy water, and instruments Whitmore didn't recognize. "Mr. Whitmore," Brennan said, extending a hand. "Thank you for receiving me." Whitmore shook it reluctantly. "I don't know what you expect to find here, Father. The boy is gone. So I've been told. But I'm not here for the boy. I'm here for the truth." Whitmore had heard those words before. From Solomon Gray, from the scholars. Everyone wanted the truth, but no one could handle it when it stared them in the face. Brennan spent the first day interviewing the household staff. He spoke to the stable hands, the cooks, the field workers. He asked the same questions over and over. What did the boy say? How did he behave? Did he exhibit any signs of illness or distress? Most of them were too afraid to answer honestly. They gave vague responses, half-truths, anything to avoid being blamed for whatever had happened. But a few spoke plainly. "He wasn't sick," said Celia, the kitchen worker. "He was clear-minded, sharp. He just knew things he shouldn't have." "What kind of things?" Brennan asked. "Old things. Like he'd lived before, like he remembered lives that weren't his." Brennan made notes in a small leather journal. "Did he ever speak of God?" Celia hesitated. "He spoke of many gods, old ones I didn't recognize." The priest's pen paused. "Old gods?" "That's what he said. He told old Ruth once that the God we pray to is young compared to the ones who came before. She told him to hush, said that was blasphemy, but he just smiled and said they were here first." Brennan closed his journal slowly. "Thank you, Celia." That night, he walked the plantation grounds alone. He visited the burned chapel, standing in the center of the ruins as the wind howled through the skeletal beams. He knelt and prayed, his voice low and steady. And then, like Solomon Gray before him, he heard it. The voice. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, soft and clear, threading through the darkness like smoke. "Ego sum qui fui, ego sum qui ero." I am who I was. I am who I will be. Brennan's breath caught. He stood slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the crucifix around his neck. Who's there? The voice continued, unfazed. Quis est tu, sacerdos? Venis querere sed me invenire non potes. Who are you, priest? You come seeking me, but you cannot find me. Brennan's heart pounded. He recognized the words. They were Latin, but not from any text he knew. The grammar was flawless, the cadence ancient. In the name of Christ, I command you to reveal yourself, Brennan said, his voice shaking. The voice laughed, not cruelly, but gently, like a parent amused by a child's misunderstanding. Christus est infans in oculis temporum, ego eram antequam ipsa erat. Christ is an infant in the eyes of time. I was before he was. Brennan staggered backward, his legs weak. He clutched the crucifix tighter, whispering prayers under his breath. But the voice didn't stop. Non sum demon, non sum angelus, sum memoria, sum omnia quae fuerunt et quae erunt. I am not a demon. I am not an angel. I am memory. I am all that was and all that will be. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the voice vanished. Brennan stood alone in the ruins, trembling, his mind racing. He had come to investigate a boy, but what he had found was something far older, far stranger, something that should not exist. The next morning, Brennan met with Whitmore in the study. The priest's face was pale, his hands unsteady as he poured himself a glass of water. I need to leave, Brennan said quietly. Whitmore frowned. You just got here. I know, but I cannot continue this investigation. Why not? Brennan looked at him, his eyes haunted. Because I don't have the authority to judge what I've encountered. This is beyond the church, beyond scripture, beyond anything I was trained for. What are you talking about? The boy, Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's not possessed, he's not a miracle. He's something else, something we don't have words for. Whitmore stared at him. You're a priest. You're supposed to have answers. I have faith, Mr. Whitmore, but faith doesn't explain this. And I'm not sure I want it to. Brennan left that afternoon. He returned to Charleston and submitted a report to Bishop England, but the contents were sealed. The church never spoke of Elias again, but Brennan kept a journal just as Solomon Gray had, and in it he wrote, If the boy spoke truth, then we are not the beginning. We are the continuation. And what we call divine may simply be the oldest memory refusing to be forgotten. At the plantation, the whispers continued. The slaves no longer feared Elias. They revered him. They began leaving offerings at the edge of the burned chapel, pieces of bread, carved sticks, scraps of cloth. They prayed to him as if he were a saint, and on certain nights, when the wind was just right, they swore they could hear him answering, in Latin, in Greek, in languages no living person had ever spoken, calm, clear, eternal. Spring arrived slowly, reluctant, as if the land itself was unsure whether to wake. The fields of the Whitmore plantation turned green again, and the slaves returned to their labor under the watchful eyes of Dutch Calloway and his men. But something fundamental had shifted. The rhythm of the plantation, the songs, the cadence of work, the quiet obedience had been disrupted. Fear had given way to something else, something harder to control. Hope. Richard Whitmore noticed it first in the way the slaves looked at him. Before, their eyes had been downcast, their movements careful and measured. Now, there was a flicker of something behind their gazes. Not defiance exactly, but awareness. As if they had remembered something they had been forced to forget. They're getting bold, Calloway said one morning, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Heard some of them singing last night. Not work songs. Something else. Something in another language. What language? Whitmore asked. Calloway shrugged. Hell if I know. Sounded old. Whitmore's jaw tightened. He had thought the story of Elias would fade with time, that the boy's disappearance would become just another tragedy in a long line of them. But instead, Elias had become something larger, a symbol, a legend, and legends were dangerous. That night, Whitmore walked the slave quarters. He rarely did so. He preferred to maintain distance, to govern through Calloway, rather than involve himself directly. But he needed to see for himself what was happening. The quarters were quiet as he approached, the small wooden cabins arranged in neat rows, smoke rising from their chimneys. But as he drew closer, he heard it. Singing. The voices were low, rhythmic, layered over one another like a chant. The melody was unfamiliar, haunting, and the words, Whitmore couldn't understand them, but they felt ancient, as if they had been passed down through generations. He stepped closer to one of the cabins and peered through a gap in the wooden slats. Inside, a group of slaves sat in a circle around a small fire. Old Ruth was at the center, her eyes closed, her hands raised. She was leading the song, and the others followed, their voices rising and falling in unison. Whitmore couldn't make out the words, but he felt them in his chest, vibrating like a drumbeat. When the song ended, Ruth opened her eyes and spoke. Elias showed us the way. He spoke the old tongues, the ones our ancestors knew before they were stolen. He reminded us who we were before we were made into slaves. One of the younger men, a field worker named Isaac, shook his head. But he's gone. What good is remembering if we're still here? He's not gone, Ruth said firmly. He's everywhere. In the wind, in the ground, in the words we speak when we think no one is listening. He's the memory we carry, and memory can't be killed. Whitmore's blood ran cold. He turned and walked back to the main house, his mind racing. This wasn't just superstition. It was something more organized, more purposeful. The slaves were building a mythology around Elias, turning him into a figure of resistance. And if he didn't stop it, it would spread beyond his plantation. It would become an idea, and ideas, once planted, were nearly impossible to uproot. The next morning, Whitmore gathered his overseers. I want the singing stopped. I want the gathering stopped. Anyone caught speaking about the boy will be punished. Calloway nodded. You want me to make an example? If necessary. But making an example proved harder than expected. When Calloway confronted Ruth the following day, she simply smiled. You can beat me, but you can't beat the truth. What truth? Calloway demanded. That we remember. That we've always remembered. And now, thanks to that boy, we remember out loud. Calloway raised his hand to strike her, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, calm, unflinching, as if she knew something he didn't. Or maybe it was the fact that a dozen other slaves had gathered around, watching in silence. He lowered his hand. Get back to work. Ruth turned and walked away, her head high. Word of Elias continued to spread beyond the Whitmore plantation. Slaves from neighboring estates whispered his name in the fields. Free black men and women in Savannah spoke of him in hushed tones, debating whether he had been a prophet, a ghost, or something else entirely. Solomon Gray heard the stories during his travels through the South. He returned to Charleston and wrote letters to abolitionists in the North, describing what he had witnessed. The boy has become a symbol, he wrote, not just of the past, but of what might be reclaimed. His words were not just Latin or Greek. They were proof that we carry within us knowledge that cannot be erased, no matter how much they try to beat it out of us. Some abolitionists dismissed Gray's accounts as folklore. Others saw potential. If the story of Elias could inspire hope, could remind enslaved people of their humanity and their history, then it was worth spreading. Pamphlets began circulating in the North. Anonymous authors retold the story, each version slightly different, but all centered on the same core. A child born into slavery who spoke the languages of empires, who proved that knowledge and memory could not be chained. In the South, plantation owners grew nervous. They increased patrols. They banned gatherings. They punished anyone caught speaking about the boy. But it didn't matter. The story had taken root. On a warm April evening, a visitor arrived at the Whitmore plantation. He was a black man in his 30s, dressed in simple but clean clothes, carrying a worn leather satchel. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Pierce, a preacher from Augusta. "I've come to see the place where the boy lived," Pierce said. Whitmore met him at the door, his expression cold. "There's nothing to see. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here to understand." "Understand what?" "Whether the story is true. Whether a child really spoke languages he never learned. Whether memory can be passed down through blood and bone." Whitmore's hand tightened on the doorframe. "The boy is dead, or gone. Either way, he's not here." Pierce nodded slowly. "Maybe. But his words are." Before Whitmore could respond, Pierce turned and walked toward the burned chapel. Whitmore considered calling for Calloway, but something stopped him. Instead, he watched as the preacher knelt in the ruins, bowing his head in prayer. Pierce stayed there for over an hour. When he finally rose, his face was streaked with tears. He returned to the main house and looked at Whitmore. "I heard him." Whitmore's stomach twisted. "You heard what?" "The boy. He's still here. Not as a ghost, as an echo, a reminder." "That's impossible." "I thought so too, but I heard him speak and I understood." Pierce's voice was steady, calm. He said, "We are not forgotten. We are not erased. We are the words they tried to silence." Whitmore said nothing. He simply closed the door. That night, Pierce left the plantation and returned to Augusta. He began preaching about Elias, telling the story to congregations of enslaved and free black people alike. He spoke of memory as a form of resistance, of language as a weapon against erasure. "They can take our bodies," Pierce told his congregation. "They can take our names, but they cannot take what we remember. They cannot take the voices of our ancestors. And if a 7-year-old boy can remind us of that, then we owe it to him and to ourselves to never forget." The story spread like fire through dry grass. From Georgia to South Carolina to Virginia, Elias became a legend. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented, the indestructibility of memory. Back at the Whitmore plantation, the slaves continued their gatherings. They sang the old songs, they spoke the old words, and when Calloway tried to stop them, they simply smiled and said, "You can't silence what's already been spoken." Whitmore grew desperate. He wrote letters to the governor, to local authorities, pleading for help in controlling his slaves. But no one knew how to fight an idea, and Elias, wherever he was, continued to speak, in the wind, in the ruins, in the memories of those who refused to forget. Calm, clear, eternal. By the summer of 1827, the name Elias had become something more than a story. It had become a movement. In the slave quarters of Georgia, the Carolinas, and even as far north as Virginia, people spoke of the boy who had defied the laws of nature and man. They told their children about him, whispered his name like a prayer, and repeated the fragments of Latin they had heard, words they didn't understand but felt in their bones. The plantation owners tried to stamp it out. They banned gatherings. They punished anyone caught speaking about the boy. They burned pamphlets and silenced preachers. But the story refused to die. It lived in the songs sung in the fields, in the prayers muttered at night, in the eyes of people who had been told they were nothing, but now remembered they were more. Richard Whitmore watched his world crumble piece by piece. The first sign of real trouble came in late June. 3 slaves from the Whitmore plantation disappeared in a single night. Not runaways? Dutch Calloway would have tracked them down within days. These were different. They left no trail, no scent for the hounds to follow. It was as if they had simply vanished. Whitmore summoned Calloway to his study. "How does this happen?" Calloway's face was red with frustration. "I don't know. We checked the swamps, the roads, the nearby plantations. Nothing. It's like they walked into thin air. People don't walk into thin air." "I know that." Calloway slammed his fist on the desk. "But I'm telling you, there's something wrong here. The slaves are talking in codes. They're using words I don't recognize. And they're not afraid anymore. That's what scares me most. They're not afraid." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Do you think it's connected to the boy?" Calloway hesitated. "I think the boy started something, and now it's bigger than him." Over the following weeks, more slaves disappeared. Not just from the Whitmore plantation, but from neighboring estates. 5 here, 7 there, always at night, always without a trace. Rumors spread that an underground network had formed, guided by those who claimed to hear Elias's voice. They said the boy's words had shown them the way to freedom, that his Latin prayers contained hidden directions, codes that only those who listened closely could understand. Plantation owners organized search parties. They increased patrols. They offered rewards for information, but the disappearances continued, and always in the places where the slaves had been, someone found the same thing: words carved into wood, scratched into dirt, written in ash. Latin words. Non obliviscar. I will not forget. In Charleston, Solomon Gray received a visitor. It was Nathaniel Pierce, the preacher from Augusta, and he looked exhausted. His clothes were dusty, his face gaunt. "I need your help," Pierce said. Gray gestured for him to sit. "What's happened?" "The network. It's real. I've been traveling with them, helping where I can. But we're running out of safe houses. The patrols are getting smarter. People are getting caught." "How many have you helped escape?" "Over 100. Maybe more. They come from all over, Georgia, South Carolina, even Alabama. They all say the same thing. They heard the voice, Elias's voice. It told them to run, to remember who they were, to refuse to be erased." Gray frowned. "But Elias is gone. How can they hear him?" Pierce leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I don't think he's gone. I think he's everywhere. His words, his memory, they've taken root in people's minds, and once someone hears it, really hears it, they can't unhear it. It changes them." Gray was silent for a moment. Then he stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down his journal. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, the Latin phrase Elias had spoken in the ruins. Ego sum qui fui. Ego sum qui ero. I am who I was. I am who I will be. He showed it to Pierce. "Do you know what this means?" Pierce nodded slowly. "It means memory is eternal, that the past doesn't die. It lives on in us. And if we remember, we can't be destroyed." "That's what he was trying to tell us," Gray said quietly. "He wasn't possessed. He wasn't a miracle. He was a reminder that we are more than what they tell us we are, that we carry the knowledge of everyone who came before us. And that knowledge is power." Pierce smiled faintly. "Then we need to make sure his message spreads." Back at the Whitmore plantation, Richard Whitmore made a decision. If he couldn't control the story, he would destroy its source. He ordered the chapel ruins demolished. Every beam, every stone, every trace of the building was to be removed and burned. He wanted the ground plowed under, planted with crops, erased from memory. Calloway supervised the work, directing a crew of reluctant slaves to tear down what remained. But as they worked, something strange happened. The wind picked up, howling through the ruins with a force that seemed unnatural. Tools slipped from hands. Ropes snapped. One of the workers swore he heard a voice, calm, clear, speaking in a language he didn't understand. By midday, 3 workers had refused to continue. By evening, the rest had followed. Calloway stood alone in the ruins, staring at the half-demolished structure. He felt it too, the presence, the weight of something he couldn't name. He walked back to the main house and told Whitmore, "We can't finish it." "What do you mean you can't finish it?" "The men won't do it. They're scared." "Scared of what, ghosts?" Calloway looked at him, and for the first time, Whitmore saw fear in the overseer's eyes. "I don't know what to call it, but it's there. And it doesn't want to be forgotten." Whitmore slammed his hand on the desk. "Then I'll do it myself." But he never did. The ruins remained, a blackened scar on the land, a monument to something no one could explain. By the end of the summer, the Whitmore plantation was in chaos. Productivity had dropped. Slaves moved slower, spoke less, but their eyes burned with a quiet defiance. Whitmore spent his days drinking and his nights pacing the halls of his empty house. He thought about Elias constantly, the boy's face, his voice, the way he had looked at Whitmore with those ancient, knowing eyes. You cannot punish what you do not understand. Whitmore understood now. Elias hadn't been the problem. The problem was what he represented, the undeniable truth that the people he enslaved were not empty vessels. They were carriers of history, of language, of memory, and no amount of violence could erase that. One night, Whitmore walked to the ruins alone. He stood in the center, staring up at the stars. "Are you still here?" he whispered. The wind answered, soft and steady, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a child's voice. Ego sum qui fui, ego sum qui ero. Whitmore sank to his knees, his hands trembling. He had lost, not to a boy, not to a ghost, to memory itself. In the months that followed, the Whitmore plantation slowly fell apart. Whitmore sold parcels of land to pay his debts. Slaves continued to disappear, guided by the network Pierce and Gray had helped build. And the story of Elias spread farther, carried by those who escaped, by preachers who dared to speak his name, by anyone who believed that memory was stronger than chains. The boy who had spoken Latin without learning it had become a legend. And legends, once born, cannot be killed. They can only grow. The year was 1831, 5 years after the fire that had consumed the chapel and erased any trace of Elias's physical presence. But the boy's legacy had only grown stronger, spreading across the South like roots beneath the earth, invisible but unbreakable. Richard Whitmore was dead. He had died alone in his study, slumped over his desk, with a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his side. The official cause was heart failure, but those who had known him in his final years said it was something else. They said he had been haunted, that he spent his nights talking to ghosts, that he had gone mad trying to understand what he had witnessed. The plantation was sold at auction. The new owner, a businessman from Savannah who had never set foot on the land, planned to modernize it, to turn it into a profitable venture once again. But he found that impossible. The slaves who remained were impossible to control. They worked when they wanted, sang songs in languages no one recognized, and disappeared one by one into the night. Within 2 years, the plantation was abandoned entirely. The land returned to the wild. The fields grew over. The main house sagged and rotted, and the ruins of the chapel, the place where Elias had last been seen, became a pilgrimage site. People came from all over. Escaped slaves traveling north would stop at the ruins and leave offerings. Carved sticks, scraps of cloth, words written in languages they barely remembered. Free black men and women from Charleston, Savannah, and Augusta made the journey to stand where the boy had stood, to hear the voice that so many claimed still lingered in the wind. Even white abolitionists came, journalists and reformers who wanted to document the legend of the slave child who had spoken in tongues. Some wrote articles that were published in northern newspapers. Others penned poems and essays, trying to capture the mystery and the meaning of what had happened, but no one could truly explain it. Solomon Gray, now an old man, returned to the ruins one final time in the summer of 1835. He walked slowly, his cane tapping against the overgrown path, and when he reached the blackened beams, he knelt and placed his hand on the scorched ground. He stayed there for hours, listening. And he heard it, faint like an echo from across time, a child's voice speaking in Latin, "Ego sum qui fui, ego sum qui ero." Gray smiled, tears streaming down his weathered face. He pulled out his journal, the same one he had been keeping for nearly a decade, and wrote his final entry. "I have spent years trying to understand what Elias was. I thought he was a miracle or a mystery, or perhaps even a message from God, but I realize now that he was something simpler and far more profound. He was memory. He was the voice of every ancestor who had been silenced, every language that had been erased, every life that had been forgotten. He was proof that we cannot be unmade, that what we carry inside us, our history, our knowledge, our humanity, is eternal, and as long as one person remembers, the story will never end. Gray closed the journal and stood. He looked up at the sky, at the same stars Elias had once named in languages no one understood, and he whispered, "Thank you." He died 3 weeks later peacefully in his sleep. His journal was published posthumously by abolitionists in the North, and it became a cornerstone of the anti-slavery movement. People read Gray's words and understood what Elias had represented. Not just a child, but a symbol of resistance, of memory, of the unbreakable human spirit. Nathaniel Pierce continued his work for another 20 years. He helped hundreds of people escape slavery, guiding them through the underground network that had formed in the wake of Elias's story. He preached in churches, in barns, in hidden clearings in the woods, always telling the same story. The slave child who spoke the language of the ancients, who reminded them that they were not forgotten. Pierce was eventually arrested in Georgia and sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, as he stood on the gallows, he was asked if he had any last words. He smiled and said, in perfect Latin, "Non obliviscar," I will not forget. The crowd fell silent. Some said they heard a child's voice echo his words. Others said it was just the wind, but everyone remembered. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, the legend of Elias had spread across the entire South. Union soldiers marching through Georgia heard the story from freed slaves. They visited the ruins of the Whitmore plantation, now little more than a pile of charred wood and overgrown weeds. And they wrote letters home, describing the strange sense of presence they felt there. One soldier, a lieutenant from Massachusetts, wrote to his wife, "We camped near the site of an old plantation last night. The men say it is haunted by a boy who spoke in dead languages. I do not believe in ghosts, but I will confess that when the wind blew through the ruins, I heard something. A voice, soft and clear, reciting words I did not understand. It gave me chills, but not from fear. It felt sacred, as if the land itself were trying to tell us something." After the war, the site was preserved by a group of freed black men and women who had heard the story and wanted to honor it. They built a small marker where the chapel had once stood, and they carved into it the words that Elias had spoken so many times, "Ego sum qui fui, ego sum qui ero." I am who I was. I am who I will be. The marker still stands today. Over the decades, scholars and historians tried to explain Elias. Some claimed he must have been taught Latin by a secret benefactor. Others suggested he had a photographic memory and had overheard passages from priests. A few speculated that he had been part of an elaborate hoax designed to inspire hope among enslaved people. But none of these explanations ever felt complete, because they couldn't explain the voice that people still claimed to hear. They couldn't explain the way his words had spread, how they had ignited something deep and primal in the hearts of those who heard them. They couldn't explain the fact that a 7-year-old boy, born into slavery and raised in silence, had known things he had no earthly way of knowing, and so the mystery remained. In 1923, a linguistics professor from Harvard named Dr. Eleanor Moss traveled to Georgia to investigate the legend. She interviewed descendants of the people who had known Elias, collected oral histories, and examined Solomon Gray's journal, which had been preserved in a university archive. She concluded her research with a paper titled "The Language of Memory, Elias and the Theory of Ancestral Knowledge." In it, she proposed a radical idea, that language, like instinct, might be passed down through generations. That within every human being lies the accumulated linguistic knowledge of every ancestor who came before them. And that, in rare cases, under extraordinary circumstances, that knowledge might surface. "Elias did not learn Latin," she wrote. "He remembered it. And if that is true, then we must reconsider what we think we know about memory, identity, and the human mind. Her paper was dismissed by most of her colleagues as pseudoscience, but a few took it seriously, and over the years, other researchers began exploring similar ideas: genetic memory, collective consciousness, the possibility that we carry within us more than we realize. Today, the ruins of the Whitmore plantation are a historical site. Tourists visit, take photographs, read the plaque that tells a sanitized version of the story. But those who stay long enough, who sit quietly in the ruins and listen, sometimes hear it. A child's voice, speaking in Latin, in Greek, in languages no living person has spoken in centuries, calm, clear, eternal. And they understand in that moment what Elias was trying to tell them, that we are not forgotten, that we cannot be erased, that as long as one person remembers, the story will never end.